Too. Hi, everyone. So my name is Amanda Kahn, but I'm speaking on behalf of a large team. The Biota team is focused on tracking any uptake or accumulation of metals related to the battery fire into plants, invertebrates, and fish in Elkhorn Slough. And so this team is multidisciplinary. And so we've got folks from here, Moss Landing Marine Labs, myself, and graduate students such as Anicia and Christian and Natalie. We've got Wes and Autumn from the Marine Pollution Studies Lab, who you just heard from Wes. And then Kirstine, our MC of the day, and April Ridlon of the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And finally, Jacob Harris and the Amamutsan land stewards have been really essential. So this is a really disciplinary and also trans institution team. And so I'm just speaking on behalf of them. And before we go into this, I'd like to thank the funding for this work, which comes from the Packard family, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They've made our analyses to date possible. And with that, when the fire started, we said, well, gosh, where might the impacts be? Where might we track? And the truth is we weren't sure. And so we took a broad scale approach. We sampled across a variety of target species spanning plants and algae, mollusks, crustaceans, other varieties of invertebrates such as sponges, fat innkeeper worms, things that we thought might be diet for higher levels in the food web, and then also fish as a higher level of the food web. Kirstine and I, when we were talking about this list, we're invertebrate zoologists. And so we've definitely spanned outside of our range of expertise. And that's been really great to talk to other groups about what taxa might be important to include. And we didn't know where to sample initially after the fire. And so we sampled broadly. So we have 4 main study sites. We've got 3 within Elkhorn Slough proper. Those are Kirby Park, high up in the slough, Whistle Stop Lagoon, and Hester Marsh, which you heard about in wonderful detail in Kirstine's and Ivano's talk. We've got the channel where Max did his work. And then out here we have the North Harbor of Moss Landing Harbor. So this is right below the restaurant and the boat launches in that area. These areas may have different degrees of exposure, both to the battery fire plume, but also from agricultural or harbor related or industrial inputs as well. And as you have heard, we were able to mobilize very quickly after the fires. The fire happened January in 2025, and sampling for the biological work happened within a week, thanks to a very quick pivot by the Amamutsan land stewards who were going out for reserve monitoring anyway and pivoted to become stewards of the slough in a broader way, which was in monitoring and sampling for the battery fire. And we at Moss Landing Marine Labs also engaged at that time. And since that time, we have a timeline up at the top. So we sampled monthly for the first 3 months following the fire. Then we expanded out the intervals of sampling. And the reason to sample for so long was to think about initial uptake of material from that higher concentration material, possibly following the fire. And then over time, there could be things like cycling or movements in the estuary, as you've been seeing, and the potential for bioaccumulation, which is when you have sort of an enhancement or an uptake and a buildup in tissues over time. And so today, I'm going to report results from those 4 sites, 7 sampling months that span 13, or sampling periods, which span 13 months, though we do have 18 months of data so far. And 3 taxonomic groups as the focus. And you saw those pictures, it would be very wrong not to acknowledge the rest of the team, which was the huge numbers of volunteers who came out and helped us. Shown here, working really hard and getting extremely sticky and muddy in the slough. And also, again, I want to call in that a big part of this process has been the land stewards. And so the Amamutsan Tribal Band has been working to reconnect with their legacy of ocean stewardship and coastal stewardship. And this has looked like restoration in the past, but, it also has grown to include stewardship by understanding and working to take care of the wetlands through understanding potential impacts from this battery fire. So they were involved from week one and have been instrumental in the field support, but also working in the trace metal lab at Marine Pollution Studies Lab to do the dissections as well. And this has been hundreds of person hours from dozens of people to do this work. So the costs have been largely covered by participating institutions or volunteers. So once samples were collected from the mud, we had to get the mud off because the mud had different concentrations of material in it. We wanted to know what was in the tissues of the animals. So back at Moss Landing Marine Labs in our aquarium room, we sorted by different taxonomic groups and then depurated them overnight, which means we left them in filtered seawater for 24 hours to poop out any material that was in their guts. And that meant that what we would measure from the tissues would be what may have been taken up in the tissues themselves. We also did freeze some directly to compare to get at that question of the effect of depuration, but I'm not going to show that today. Then painstakingly, animals were frozen until they could be individually weighed, measured, and then dissected. And all of the soft tissues were dissected out, homogenized, blended together, and composited. So that means that we took several individuals and we mixed their tissues together. The analytical cost for running ICP-MS is very high. And to be able to measure the variability that might be differing from individual to individual, doing these composites gave us the ability to capture some of that variability and balance it with the cost of analysis. And the analysis was ICP-MS, which you've heard about, and that actually detects 12 metals, 3 of which are the metals that are present in the battery cathodes. And you can see folks here in the trace metal lab. So results, we have tons of data. We're drowning in data, which is kind of a great problem to have at this point in time. And we're only going to show you a subset today. We're still parsing through I like how Max said it of like in our papers, we're going to be able to go into all the nitty gritty details, but we hope to give you a broad overview. Generally though, we measured 12 different metal concentrations from every sample. So you can see them down here. The 3 battery metals are going to be presented throughout the talk in blue. So those are cobalt, nickel, and manganese. But here in green are other metals that are also measured from ICP-MS. And this is just an example from one species. So, right. And so for today, we're going to focus on cobalt as an indicator of the battery fire, though we have data on the others, and arsenic as a reference metal that was not related to the battery fire. We also measured metal concentrations from 4 sites, right? I showed you North Harbor, Hester Marsh, Whistle Stop Lagoon, and Kirby Park. But for simplicity, we're going to average across sites for most of the analyses today. And then we measured metal concentrations across many months. As I said, in this case, for this particular species, we have 5 different sample periods. For some, we had more. But for simplicity, for most of the analyses, we will average across the dates from today. And we measured metal concentrations across many different species. So you can see the range and variety down here. This is what we've analyzed so far. So the focus of the talk today will be on a variety of bivalves here, gastropods or snails, and crabs. These are invertebrate groups. They are in other studies, groups that have been useful indicators or biomonitoring groups for tracking. And for some of them, they're numerically very abundant in the estuary. So they were good ones to sample across. We also tried to consider taxa that might be important diet items for other higher level trophic groups. Trophic groups are the food web, right? Things like seabirds or humans or harbor seals, right? There are lots of predators that interact with these groups in the slough. And so for today's talk, we'll focus on some of the most common ones that we collected, shown here. So like you saw there in other talks, we didn't have any one quick way to be able to ask whether there might have been an input of battery metals into biota in the slough. And so we used a variety of approaches, and we're going to walk through these. So we asked, were metal concentrations initially elevated following the fire? We don't have baseline data for these animals. There was not baseline collection because no one knew that there would be a fire. Although, as Kerstin suggested and mentioned in her talk, we are working to find who has samples in their freezers that could be co-opted or brought in as baseline data. But we could ask, were metal concentrations higher right after the fire, and what happened to them over time? Also, after finding out that the main plume of the fire went east over the slough, we asked, were metal concentrations higher in slough sites than in the harbor site? We asked whether the metals were correlated, which could be consistent with them having a common source. What about those 3 battery metals? Were they more correlated with each other than with other metals? We also wanted to know, do animals with different modes of feeding take up metals differently? So what are the pathways that metals might be taken up and moved into food webs and animals? And finally, were battery metal concentrations higher than in other estuaries? So let's see. Let's start with that first question. And so when we ask, were battery metals initially elevated following the fire, we're really asking, then did they decline over time? And specifically, let's do a comparison. How might they compare for a battery metal, cobalt, versus our non-battery example metal of arsenic? So I'm always going to start this way when presenting these, where we'll start with a single plot, interpret it, and then I'll show you more because you will see science has lots of variability in it. So up here, sorry, I have a laser here. So up here, this is the line shore crab, Pachygrapsis crassipes, and down here, this is the earliest period of sampling, January 2025, and then we have later dates here. And so the cobalt concentration started up here, and then it declined in later months. So that slope downward tells us that they were initially higher and then went down. And we can use a p-value in statistics for our linear regression and a correlation to show us how closely or tightly that relationship holds. And if we look across species, we see a similar shape or trend for many of the species where there were concentrations that were highest in those months immediately following the fire, and then they declined over time. So we've got a variety of species here. The next slide, I'm just going to transform the graphs now. We're going to ask the same question, but for arsenic, right? Our non-battery metal. So for arsenic, the result is less clear. So we see that for some taxa, there still looks like there may have been a slope that moves downward, but you can also see that the points are much more spread out. There's a lot more variability. And for some taxa, that same shape did not hold. So let's go to the next question. How about, did battery metals show different spatial patterns than non-battery metals? And specifically, was cobalt that we measured from the slough sites higher than in the harbor site? And so for this, recall here's a map of our sites. That harbor site here probably receives the highest agricultural, boating, and industrial contaminants coming in just by its location near this industrial area and the harbor and having all of this runoff here. The slough sites potentially also will have a lot of agricultural input from watershed runoff, but based on where the plume was, could have been more affected by the battery fire plume. And so looking at our line shore crab here, we've got our harbor site here and our Elkhorn slough site here, and we see that the cobalt concentrations measured were higher in the Elkhorn slough sites than they were in the harbor sites. And this pattern looks to be pretty consistent, though to differing degrees, for these 4 taxa. We chose 4 taxa here because we had to be able to have groups that we could find from every different location, and animals don't live everywhere you want them to. So what about arsenic? So let's go for our non-battery metal. So for this one, the results are less clear. For some, it looks like it was higher, but for others, that was not the case. So there wasn't as much of a consistent pattern as what we saw. Next up, were the metals correlated, consistent with a common source? And specifically, we could ask about a correlation between two battery-associated metals with each other. And we could also ask, what about if we take a battery-associated metal and compare it with one that's not? How does the correlation differ? So if we ask, were cobalt and nickel correlated? Yes, they were. We can see here that, as you saw with some of the plots in earlier talks, there's a line or a curve here and a tight p-value and r-value that tell you that that correlation is significant. And we see that correlation, again, to differing degrees of significance across a variety of different taxa. And so we're going to transform this slide again. So for correlating cobalt with arsenic, a non-battery metal, that relationship is not as clear. So there's less of a correlation between those two metals. They have less of a relationship, meaning or suggesting that they may not have the same source coming in. All right, next line to explore. Are battery-associated metals more tightly correlated with each other than with other metals, as you would expect if they share a common source? So this is using a very broad scale analysis called a principal components analysis, which takes in a lot of different metals and asks, based on the data that we have, how closely or how similarly are the metals driving the patterns that we see? So we'll say if we see the battery-associated metals showing more coherence or tightness with each other than with other metals, that's suggesting a tightness or consistent source, common source. So here's what a PCA looks like. The dots are everywhere, but if you look at these arrows, you can see that the three battery metals here are all clustered together and pointing in the same direction, which based on this analysis is saying that they are having similar sort of relationships. And that was true even if the direction of those arrows changed in this multivariate analysis. They're still kind of clustering tightly with each other. And you could see other metals go all different directions and cluster in different ways. All right, how about feeding modes? Okay, so we wanted to ask, what if you have animals that feed differently? So deposit feeders are taxa who snuffle along and take up sediments and take the organic material out of those sediments. So the pathway that they would be exposed to material is through mud. Whereas suspension feeders eat material that is up in the water column, like phytoplankton. And so we wanted to ask which group may have taken up or been exposed to more of these materials. And so if we asked for cobalt, it looked like, yes, deposit feeders had higher concentrations of cobalt compared to suspension feeders. What about for arsenic? Yes. So actually, it turns out deposit feeders eat mud. They're exposed to a lot of different materials and metals. And so this is not really showing any kind of link necessarily with the battery fire. And this is just something that's fascinating and interesting about the way animals work and eat. And finally, Anicia, a graduate student on the project, did a really deep dive in the scientific published literature to explore what concentrations have been measured in other estuaries. She focused on bivalves, and up here in blue are the published values of cobalt concentrations for bivalves, and down here are what we measured, and you can see that cobalt concentrations from Elkhorn Slough were at the higher end of what's been measured from other published studies. So you saw the results, so I'm gonna just show these here. In terms of the approaches that we took for detecting a potential fire signal, we have supportive patterns, but again, we can't make that link. We don't have pre-fire samples to necessarily say yet, but we have a lot of consistent things that are consistent with that. All right, but the big question, are the metal concentrations that we measured in this study of concern for the health of slough animals? Oh boy, we don't know, right? Because what we've done is we've measured concentrations. We don't know what that effect may have had on the populations. Did population sizes change? And what's going to happen to those over time? So not knowing is not the same as no, but we are learning a lot, and we could see that those metals came in. Bioaccumulation can occur slowly, especially as material is mobilized into different parts of the estuary. And the biggest threats are probably the top predators that eat a lot of the invertebrates that we examined in this study. So for example, sea otters are year-round residents in Elkhorn Slough, and they eat a lot of invertebrates, around 11 pounds per day for a 55-pound sea otter. That's a lot. I can't eat that much in a day. And they eat most of the species that we've been showing you data on. So let's do a quick thought experiment. If an otter ate only the prey species that we analyzed with the lowest cobalt concentration, that would be the California mussel, it would have consumed about 5 milligrams of cobalt per day over the past year. If an otter ate only its entire diet of the prey species with the highest concentration, the bent-nosed clam, it would have eaten about 25 milligrams of cobalt per day over the past year. The real number probably lies somewhere between those, right? It's a range, there's variation. Now, we don't know whether that amount of cobalt is hazardous for a sea otter, but we can explore, for humans, acute negative effects of cobalt have been detected based on their body weight to be 0.03 milligrams per kilogram of human body weight. How do we translate that? Well, if we take a 25 kilogram sea otter, we multiply that by what is hazardous for a human, we come out to about 0.75 milligrams per day. So what does that mean? Well, it means otters in the slough consumed a lot of cobalt in the last year, more than would be good for them if they were humans. Again, we don't know what an otter needs or doesn't need. Still, it should be said there were no noted increases in otter mortality in the slough in the year following the fire. So if there were effects, they would not have been deadly, or they would have been sublethal. Now that's what we have today, but next steps, there are many more questions to answer, such as what are the patterns of bioaccumulation that are shown by other taxa? We have a lot of additional invertebrates in the freezer that span a lot of other modes of feeding and uptake. Plus, we have fish that we've collected, though we'd like to get larger ones that people may fish and eat within the slough themselves. And we still have plants and algae that are giving us some analytical woes, but we're going to overcome them and we'll be able to get the base of the food web as well. We also want to ask, we really want to know, how do these battery metal concentrations in the slough organisms post-fire compare to pre-fire conditions or to sites outside the plume area? So as Kerstin mentioned, we can look at some of these relationships by collecting samples that other people have collected for other purposes and getting some of these pre-fire signals. And also we've had help now getting specimens from farther away areas, like we just got mussels and shore crabs from Davenport to compare. And we want to ask, what about next steps? For example, can pickleweed, a marsh plant, play a role in restoring or removing metals from the soil? Related species have been planted elsewhere and they can lock metals into their roots and make them less available. So we're currently collecting samples of pickleweed stems and roots from around the estuary to explore this. And if they prove to play a role, then pickleweed could be planted in bare areas of Hester Marsh and other locations to help work with restoration and removal. But those questions are things that we would love to do, but we need more funding to do it. So it's been expensive to work on this. It's about $100 to $150 per sample to analyze. And so we really, have a lot more that we can and want to explore. But that said, this has been a grassroots collaboration and it's helped us understand a lot about potential impacts of the battery fire on slough organisms. And we have lots more that we want to do. So thanks.
Time for a couple of quick questions. Okay, so Ivana was talking about how initially when the fire happened, the three metals were grouped together in a BB. And then over time, how those degraded and separated and dissolved. From an animal perspective, when you're uptaking that, is there a difference, like in terms of toxicity when it's as a BB versus three compounds dissolved? Do you know that?
Yeah, well, in terms of the ratio, absolutely. So our bodies do all kinds of things with metals as we eat them or take them up. Some get excreted more. And so that signal that was very detectable cleanly in sediments may not be so clean in tissues as tissues change over time, though there were correlations, right, in those tissues. And then in terms of how the toxicity may change with the speciation, we don't know that. And that's something that would be really great to do in laboratory experiments to, for example, what Max and Ivano mentioned was to look at the speciation of the metals and also whether after they're burned, they have different levels of uptake or toxicity in the animals. Did that get at your question?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Wes, are there any questions on Zoom?
Yes, there is, and you touched on it just a second ago a little bit, but I think there's more to it here. Are heavy metals ever purged from tissues once accumulated, or do declining cobalt concentrations represent sampling of a new invert cohort? What is the natural lifespan of Pachy?
Ooh, I don't think I know that off the top of my head, that part. Yeah, that is a good question about what's the population dynamics of the group. So we should look into that a bit, but they do live more than a year. So, you know, the taxa that we're collecting are going to be exposed, time integrated across their lifespans. Yeah, I think that's about as far as I can say in terms of the specifics of the lifespans. Bivalves live a lot longer. So, you know, that's kind of a exposure. We also want to look at things like the shells of bivalves, which can be like a time series and look back in time at the shells to see if we can see any kinds of patterns of exposure within an individual. But we haven't tried that just yet.
Emily?
I know that your focus is on invertebrates, but based on, I know that you're doing a predictive kind of extrapolation of exposure to say sea otters that eat the invertebrates. Given that guess, that prediction, are there people, say like the Marine Mammal Center that have that information that maybe could do, you know, they rescue sea otters or, you know, deal with, you know, dead animal carcasses? Is anybody going to be doing continuing studies on, say, sea otters in the area to kind of confirm whether or not this has happened?
Yes, so the sea otter research team is much more well-funded per species than any of our invertebrates. And they have ever since the beginning of the fire been looking really closely to see if there was greater mortality of pups or any greater mortality. And they've been necropsying any animals they found. And they are still analyzing some of the data on those necropsies, but they are on it. We just don't have clear answers yet.
Are they speaking today?
No, they weren't ready.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question.
Which of the animals, if any, do people eat? Like the crabs and other shellfish? And have you guys looked into like how it might affect people eating these animals?
Yes, people eat typically red rock crabs, which we've collected, and a lot of people were out right among us digging for clams while we were digging for clams.
Yeah.
So bivalves, and then that's also why we're trying to catch larger fish, is to get, you know, people will go fishing within the slough. So those are the ones that humans might be exposed to, and that's why we chose to include them in our sampling. The only ones that we have data for, well, we have all the bivalves data, and we've got the red rock crabs when we are able to catch them and find them. Yeah.
Okay.
Was there more to that question? That was kind of the where.
No, are there alerts out for those fishers and those folks that are digging, looking for clams and crabs?
Well, we let California Department of Public Health know that we were sampling that, but it's not up to us to put out alerts, I think, for that. We just measure the concentrations in the tissues. But I think none of the concentrations that we've measured are in the range of alarmingly high. I think that was the, like, for an immediate response. They're the values that you see that are within range of what has been measured in the estuary before, even if at the higher end.
I think signage is a good issue. I mean, even before the fire, my instinct would be one shouldn't eat too much out of the slough. Because we have a lot of contaminants, and I think the signage is not, it could be better.
Yeah.
For this and other reasons. Oh, sure.
Real quick, just how much more money do you need for the next phase? You know, let's think about it. Maybe one will stroke a check.
Yeah. I know. Well, I'll just give you the estimate of it's $100 to $150 a sample. So to be able to do a survey of, say, another set of species across the 7 months of sampling and to have our replicates, that's automatically looking at 20 more samples. So there's, a way to kind of add and build up from there.
50,000.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's kind of the range, I think.
And Max will field the question here too.
I think I can say that, but basically everything was presented today from Amber, that was about 200K, right? So if you want to continue, that's what we need at minimum.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Basically, we'd love to do about as much as we've already done. We don't want to, continue this forever. We all have other research foci that we usually focus on, not battery fire. But given what we've analyzed, we'd love to do about as much as we've done in the past 18 months for another 18 months.
$500,000 would allow all this research to move forward.
Correct. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.